Hello YouTube. So we're here with another episode of car maintenance video. One of the primary consumable in the modern automobile is brake pads and the brake rotors, and in my opinion they're probably one of the easier thing anybody can attempt to do. First thing I would do if I'm new to car maintenance is do an oil change. I have a video for that. And the second, in terms of skill level, you want to step up to is a brake change. So let's talk about all the tools first, and then we'll kind of show you how we do it, right? So this is brake change requires you to take off the wheel. So the standard disclaimer on safety applies. You know, you make sure you're on a level surface, jack it up, use the jack stands even after you jack up. So we're going to use this hydraulic pump jack to lift it up, the race jack, and then we're going to support it with a couple of stationary jacks underneath. Supplies, you need a brake pad obviously, and I typically replace the brake rotor every other time I change the brake pad, rather than having them refinished every time you do brake change. So as you can see right here, we're like a little bit worn out. I can still resurface this and get another 30,000 mile out of it, but since I do a lot of my maintenance to save time. Okay, so I spend a little bit money and get everything done in one go. Okay, some sort of braking, if you have a power tool, that's great. Otherwise you can use a standard breaker bar and some sockets. Typically the wheel lugs are in millimeters, so make sure you have a metric socket bar stand and some miscellaneous hand tool. As we go through, you'll see some of them, we're going to use them. And the most important part when you do brake job is the C-clamp, right? And this is mainly to compress the piston back in the caliper when you remove the old brake pad and try to put a new one, because the old one obviously gonna be worn out, so your piston gonna be sticking out like a 3/8 of an inch or more most of the time, and unless you push it back in, you're not gonna be able to put the brake pad and the caliper back on. So we're gonna start removing everything, and we'll do some commentary as I do fast forward. That's how I find it typical to kind of point out things I'm doing. So hang on tight and we're gonna get this thing done. Thanks. When you want to jack up the car, make sure you break the lug bolts beforehand, like half a turn or so. And when you're doing a brake job, you want to jack up from underneath the shock absorber and put the stationary jacks in place. That will help you. That way you don't have to jack up the car too high. If you let the shock absorber push out, it's gonna be too high, so that's not good. So I like to put jack underneath the shock absorber, and then you can remove both the wheel, all the lug nuts and everything. Talk a little bit about how a brake caliper setup is typically on most cars. This is a 2013 Ford Explorer, but most cars, I've done a number of them, they're very similar. So what it is there's a caliper, and caliper has two pieces. One is a fixed piece that's kind of bolted with a bolt on the back here. Oh, I don't know, you can see that right there. That's a parking bolt, as well as it mounts on there it is. So this bolt right there and that bolt, those are the bolts that hold up the whole caliper assembly. And then there's a floating piece that's held up in place by a couple of banjo bolts. 1 and 2, they have typically that little accordion kind of plastic bushing on top of that. So this part is fixed, that one is moving, and that moving part is what's got the typically a piston that pushes on the brake pad either side of this rotor brake rotor. The rotor itself is typically just held in place just like that with your lug bolt, or sometimes you'll see one of you know, this kind of bolt, a screw that's holding it in place on top of the axle bush bearing. So that's generally how the setup is. The only thing you have to be careful when you work with the caliper, see this line here, that's your brake line coming in to the caliper, and that's typically a flexible rubber line. So no matter what you do not drop this caliper. You're gonna either crack this pipe or break it, worst case, and then you have another thing to replace. Okay, so just use a little hanger, a cloth hanger that you can kind of tie it up if you need to step away from it, but I typically just put it right on the top of the wheel bearing, and just be careful, don't knock it over, stuff like that. So we're gonna get to it now. Since we're replacing this brake rotor, that's why I removed this bolt here. That's let's see, what is it? This is a T40 star bit that's holding up this rotor onto the hub. And also we open these two bolts. Those are 15 millimeter bolt holding the entire caliper body onto the hub again. Now if you are just replacing the brake pads, then you don't have to take out those body bolts. All you have to open brake pad change is these two banjo bolts, and so it becomes quite easier just if you're replacing the brake itself. Okay, so I just wanted to mention that. So once you remove the caliper bolt, make sure the parking brake is disengaged and you can pull the caliper out. Now removing the brake rotor is a little bit harder. You may have to bang on it, put some lube if you need to, but it needs some persuasion. Working on a wheel bearing or brake or something, you try to open a bolt that's on the wheel bearing. Well, bearing's gonna keep rotating, and that's not good. So on the rear wheel you have a parking brake. You can use that to jam up the, but when you're putting things back together, how you work with that, right? So what you do is kind of use this little breaker bar as your kind of jamming device, right? So you put it like this, and so it kind of jams it into place, and now you can put some torque on it and open the thing, and it won't move on you. So that's a little trick. All right, so now we're gonna put the new rotor on and secure with the machine screw. We're not gonna tighten the machine screw for just yet. We'll do it at the end. And then you can put the caliper back on. Notice that we still haven't removed the old brake pad. It's still in there, and we're putting the bolts back. We're using a blue Loctite to mount the caliper back on the wheel bearing assembly. Now we're going to tighten those bolts really nicely and tight, and eventually we'll torque it. But these bolts typically have a pretty high torque, so you can really tighten them up. For Ford Explorer, the spec says it needs to be 118 foot-pound torque, so now you're using a torque wrench to torque it down to the proper spec. And after we put it back on, now this is the part, if you're just replacing the brake pad, this is where you would start, right? You just remove those two banjo bolts and remove the moving part of the caliper assembly, remove the old brake pads, and then put the new one on. Now when you put the new brake pads on, you want to clean up the rotor really nicely, and also lube any metal to metal contact points with a brake grease. Notice the direction of the pad that you put in. Remember the old one. Some cars have a different pad for front and back. Some pad might come with a new clips, so you can replace those clips. Each pad is a little bit different. This one doesn't have any clips, and they're both same. And after this is the hardest part, is pushing the piston back in the caliper assembly. That way you can put this caliper back on to the new brake pads. Otherwise there won't be enough room to put the caliper back on its place. So this is the part where you have to fight with the C-clamp and all that. Alright, so my GoPro died on me while I was pushing the piston back using my C-clamp here. So a couple of tricks. Use the C-clamp and grease the thread really nicely. It helps the push better. This piston was kind of sticking out halfway through because the brake pads were worn out and it keeps pushing and pushing. So we pushed it all the way back now. It should be flush along with this piston seal. And when you use the C-clamp, try to line up the back of the C-clamp exactly in the center, and the front thing, this part also exactly in the middle. So this part should, there's generally, the back side of the caliper is usually not flat, and I don't know you can see it or not, but it's this one's got a, because it's a back one, it's got a brake, the parking brake bolt sticking out. If it's a front one, the front is a little bit easier. It's got a flat back on the caliper. But either way, this is the hardest part of doing a brake pad replacement job, is pushing this piston back. All right. So now we're gonna put the moving part of the caliper back with those banjo bolts. Now these banjo bolts have a very low torque setting. Okay, so don't tighten them at too much. They're not designed to be cranked down like crazy. They on the Ford Explorer, they only have, like, if I remember correctly, it's 18 foot-pound or something, very low. So just tighten it based on your car's make and model. Now we're tightening down the machine screw for the brake rotor. We put the wheel back on, and at this point you want to put the lug bolts on just enough to kind of be snug. Don't tighten them really tightly. So we're just using our torque wrench to kind of tighten them up enough to put the wheel back on, touching. And then you want to remove the jack stands, and then finally, once the wheels are touching the ground, that's when you want to torque them down to the proper spec. Now, I don't typically torque them based on the spec. I've changed enough tires to kind of get the feel of how tight they should be with my breaker bar. So that's what I do, but if you're not sure, use a torque wrench.